They called him a relic before he even touched the ground. A human structure specialist sent to a world that had forgotten how to build with anything other than light and sound. To the High Council of Xylos, he was a primitive necessity. A pair of dirty hands to fix the grimy physical foundations their minds were too elevated to acknowledge. But in the echoing halls of the Sun-Spire, where perfection was the law and emotion was a liability, Ronin found something that wasn't just broken. He found someone who was lonely. Before we begin this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We release new stories from the frontier every week, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Now let's dive in. The heat in the lower maintenance sublevels of the Spire was oppressive, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled perfection of the upper palace. Ronin wiped a streak of grease across his forehead, leaving a dark smudge on his pale skin. He was 3 hours into a shift that was supposed to take 1, his shoulder aching from the recoil of the plasma welder. "Damned crystalline matrices," Ronin muttered, adjusting his heavy work gloves. "Pretty to look at, nightmare to anchor." Ronin was a man built for a different era. Here on Xylos, amidst the Xylians, tall luminous beings with skin like polished marble and voices like wind chimes. He was a brute, a solid. That's what they called humans, solids, because they didn't shimmer, they didn't phase, and they certainly didn't float. He was tightening the primary coupling on a vibration damper when he felt eyes on him. It wasn't the security drones. They hummed. This was silent. Ronin paused, his hand hovering over his tool belt. He turned slowly, expecting a supervisor to reprimand him for sweating too loudly. Instead, he saw a pair of eyes glowing with a soft, terrified violet hue, peeking out from behind a stack of discarded conduit pipes. "Hey there," Ronin said, his voice rough from the dry air. He crouched down, trying to make his 6-foot frame look less imposing. "You know, this sector isn't exactly a playground. You lose a finger in one of these gravity lifts, it doesn't grow back." The figure stepped out. She was small, perhaps the equivalent of a human 7-year-old, though Xylian biology was notoriously hard to map. She wore a gown of woven starlight that seemed to flow around her like liquid, but the hem was torn, stained with the gray dust of the maintenance shafts. Her skin was a pale lilac, her hair a floating halo of silver strands that defied gravity. Ronin sighed. He'd seen this look before on strayed dogs and refugees. "I'm not going to report you," he said, turning back to his work, but leaving his body language open. "If you're hiding, you picked a good spot." The girl took a step closer, her eyes fixed on the welding torch in his hand. "It creates fire," she whispered. "Plasma," Ronin corrected gently. "Hotter than fire. Used to melt metal so it sticks together." "We do not melt," she said, tilting her head. "We weave. We sing the crystal into shape." "Yeah, well," Ronin chuckled, picking up a twisted scrap of metal. "Then you need a solid to come in and weld the bones back together." He saw her flinch at the word solid. Ronin decided to own it. "I'm Ronin," he said. He didn't offer a hand. His were covered in grime, but he nodded respectfully. "I am Valérine," she hesitated. Ronin froze. He might be a blue-collar worker from a backwater Earth colony, but he knew the hierarchy. The High Queen's name was Solara. Her daughter, the heir apparent, the voice of the future, was Princess Valérine. He was currently talking to the future ruler of the sector in a dirty basement while holding a blowtorch. "Your Highness," Ronin said, starting to rise to a bow. "No!" Valérine surged forward, her small hand grabbing the fabric of his heavy work trousers. "Please, do not be formal." Ronin looked down at the terrified royal child clinging to his grease-stained cargo pants. He looked at the door. He looked back at her. "Okay," Ronin said, settling back down on his heels. No bowing. "But if the royal guard busts in here and vaporizes me, I'm blaming you." A tiny musical sound escaped her lips. A giggle. "Agreed." That afternoon, the structural integrity of the Spire's Sector 4 remained at 98%, but the structural integrity of Ronin's solitude shattered completely. Valérine didn't just watch. She asked questions. She didn't understand heat, or friction, or leverage. In her world, things moved because you willed them to, because you harmonized with them. The idea that you had to force a bolt to turn was fascinating to her. "Why do you fix it?" she asked, watching him struggle with a rusted valve. "Why not replace it with new light constructs?" "Because," Ronin grunted, finally feeling the metal give way with a satisfying screech. "Old things have stories, and sometimes the old stuff is stronger than the new stuff because it's already survived the stress test. You don't throw something away just because it's struggling. You support it. Valérine went quiet at that. She traced a pattern in the dust on the floor. My mother says that which cannot maintain its own perfection is flawed, and flaws must be excised. Ronin wiped his hands on a rag, looking at the small, lonely girl who probably felt like a flaw in a perfect diamond. Your mother, Ronin said carefully, has never had to keep a 30-ton atmospheric scrubber running with a roll of duct tape and a prayer. Perfection is boring, Valérine. It's the cracks that let the light in. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a fidget toy he'd made from spare bearings and washers, a crude gyroscope. He spun it on the concrete floor. It whirred, wobbly at first, then stabilizing into a perfect humming spin. Physics, Ronin said. It wants to fall, but the motion keeps it standing. It fights gravity. Valérine watched it with wide violet eyes. It dances. Keep it, Ronin said. Hide it in your pocket. When you feel like you're going to fall, give it a spin. Valérine looked at him, and for the first time, Ronin saw the heavy weight of an empire lift from her shoulders. Thank you, Ronin. 3 months passed. Ronin became a ghost in the palace. He was efficient, invisible, and essential. The Xylian overseers treated him with a mixture of disdain and grudging necessity. They sneered at his tools, at his heavy boots, at the way he smelled of ozone and sweat. But when the atmospheric stabilizers in the East Wing groaned, they called Ronin. And every Tuesday and Thursday, during the gap in the royal education schedule, Valérine would vanish. She found him in the cooling towers. She found him in the sub-basements. Once, she found him suspended 400 feet in the air on a maintenance rig, polishing the exterior sensor array. She had simply floated up to him, hovering on a gravity disk, terrifying him half to death. You're high up, she had observed calmly. And you're supposed to be in diplomacy training, Ronin had shouted over the wind. Ambassador Kale talks too much, she shouted back. Show me how the wrench works. They developed a rhythm. He shared his ration packs with her. Synthetic chocolate and dried fruit that she found overwhelmingly flavorful compared to the nutrient mists of the court. In return, she taught him the basics of Xylian harmonics. She showed him how to listen to the crystal walls, how to hear the stress fractures before they became visible. But Ronin noticed things the court didn't. He noticed the tremors in her hands. He noticed how the perfect Queen Solara never actually looked at her daughter, only through her, assessing her as one would assess a sculpture for defects. One evening, Ronin was working late in the primary hangar when Queen Solara swept in with her entourage. She was 10 feet of radiant indifference, her robes trailing light. She stopped near Ronin's workstation not to acknowledge him, but to speak to her advisor. The resonance frequency of the air is off, the Queen stated cold, her voice like cracking ice. Valérine struggles to maintain the harmonics during the reception. It is embarrassing. She is young, Your Radiance, the advisor soothed. She is Xylian, the Queen snapped. She is not some solid creature of dirt and bone. If she cannot harmonize by the Grand Ascension, she will be sequestered until she is corrected. Ronin gripped his wrench so hard his knuckles turned white. He was beneath their notice, a piece of furniture with a pulse, but he heard. Valérine wasn't a person to them. She was a frequency to be tuned. Later that night, Valérine appeared in his workshop. She didn't ask about tools. She didn't smile. She sat on his workbench, her legs swinging listlessly. They are going to sequester me, she whispered. Ronin put down his datapad, I heard. I try, Ronin, she said, her voice trembling. I try to hold the note. I try to be perfect light. But my mind, it wanders. I think about the gyroscope. I think about the chocolate. I feel heavy. You feel real, Ronin said fiercely. He walked over and stood in front of her. Valérine, look at me. She looked up, tears of liquid mercury pooling in her eyes. There is nothing wrong with you. You are trying to be a statue when you're a living being. They want you to be a frequency. I think you're a symphony. Just a messy one. Solids break, she sobbed. I am breaking. Then we fix it, Ronin said. We brace the weak spots. We redistribute the load. You're not alone in this structure anymore, kid. You've got a structural engineer on your side. He reached out, hesitating, then placed a large, warm hand on her shoulder. It was a breach of protocol punishable by exile, or worse. Xylians did not touch. They exchanged energy fields. They did not hug. Valérine froze at the contact, the heat of his hand seeping through her silk robes. Then she leaned into it. She leaned into the solidity of him, the unmoving, unshakable reality of a human being. "Stand tall," Ronin murmured. "Let them sing. You just be." The day of the Grand Ascension arrived with the subtlety of a supernova. The spire was filled with dignitaries from 50 star systems. The air shimmered with psychic projections and holographic displays. It was a celebration of Xylian purity, a demonstration of their mastery over physics and mind. Ronin was not invited, obviously, but Ronin was there. He was stationed in the service alcove surrounding the Great Hall, monitoring the vibration stress caused by 10,000 beings humming in unison. His datapad showed the load-bearing readings in the red, but within tolerance. In the center of the hall, on a raised dais of translucent opal, stood Queen Solara and Princess Valérine. The ceremony began. The choir of the high priests started the harmonic chant. The sound wasn't heard with ears. It was felt in the marrow. The crystal walls of the spire began to glow, responding to the song. Ronin watched from the shadows. Valérine looked small, too small. She was pale, her light dim. She was trying to match the frequency of the queen. But the queen was a star, and Valérine was a candle in a hurricane. "Hold on, kid," Ronin thought, his eyes glued to the sensors. Then, the alarm on his datapad blinked. It wasn't a structural failure. It was a feedback loop. The visiting dignitaries, specifically the Carathians, who wore heavy localized shield generators, were creating an interference pattern. The Xylian harmonics were bouncing off the shields and amplifying. The room began to vibrate. At first, only the solids in the room. Servants, guards noticed. The Xylians were too lost in the trance, but Ronin felt it in his teeth. The floor plates were rattling. "Stabilize," Ronin whispered, tapping frantically on his console to adjust the dampeners. "Come on, compensate." On the dais, Valérine faltered. The feedback was hitting her hardest. She grabbed her head, her song breaking. Queen Solara opened her eyes, not with concern, but with fury. She intensified her own output, trying to force the harmony back into alignment, trying to force her daughter to comply through sheer will. It was the wrong move. Crack! A sound like a gunshot echoed through the hall. A fissure appeared in the massive decorative crystal spire directly above the dais. The feedback loop had found the stress point. The music stopped. The silence that followed was terrifying. Dust fell from the ceiling. The massive shard, weighing easily 2 tons, groaned. The queen looked up, frozen. Her mind could manipulate energy, but she had never learned to react to falling rocks. She was paralyzed by the impossibility of her perfect world failing. Valérine looked up, eyes wide. Ronin didn't look. He moved. He had analyzed the trajectory before the crack had even finished sounding. He didn't run like a Xylian, gliding and graceful. He ran like a human, boots slamming into the floor, muscles straining, breath tearing from his lungs. He burst from the service alcove, sprinting across the sacred floor of the Great Hall. "Move!" Ronin roared, his voice booming without any psychic amplification, just raw, desperate volume. He hit the dais like a linebacker. He didn't try to stop the rock. That was physics, and physics said he would lose. He tackled Valérine. He grabbed her around the waist, his momentum carrying them both off the high platform, rolling them across the polished floor, just as the massive crystal shard slammed into the spot where she had been standing. Boom! The impact shook the entire station. Shards of crystal exploded outward like shrapnel. Ronin curled his body around the small alien princess, turning his back to the blast. He felt the sharp sting of crystal slicing through his uniform, cutting into his back and arms. He gritted his teeth, squeezing his eyes shut, shielding her head with his hand. Then silence, absolute, ringing silence. Slowly, the dust settled. The dignitaries were gasping. The queen was standing unharmed, but staring at the crater next to her throne. Ronin groaned, the sound echoing in the quiet. He shifted, his back screaming in pain, and loosened his grip. "Valérine," he coughed. "You okay?" Beneath him, the princess was shaking. She opened her eyes. She saw the debris. She saw the blood soaking into the back of Ronin's gray mechanic shirt. "Red," she whispered. "You are bleeding red." "It's what we do," Ronin wheezed, rolling off her and sitting up. He checked his side, deep cut, but not lethal. "I'm fine, just a scratch." He looked up. 10,000 eyes were staring at him. The queen was staring at him. The royal guard had their weapons raised, their tips glowing with lethal energy. "Step away from the air," the captain of the guard shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "Filth! You dare touch the royal person?" Ronin slowly raised his hands. "I was just— Silence!" Queen Solara stepped down from the dais. Her perfection was cracked. She was furious. You have defiled the Ascension. You have laid violent hands on my daughter. You have brought your dirt into this holy place." She pointed a long, elegant finger at him. "Dispose of him." The guard stepped forward. Ronin braced himself. He didn't have a weapon. He had a wrench and a bad back. "No!" The scream didn't come from Ronin. It came from Valerine. The small princess scrambled up from the floor, but she didn't run to her mother. She didn't run to safety. She turned and threw herself at Ronin. It wasn't a polite gesture. It was a tackle. She slammed into his chest, wrapping her thin lilac arms around his waist, burying her face in his blood-stained shirt. She held on with a strength that defied her size. Silence fell. It was a heavier silence than before. This was the silence of a worldview shattering. A Xylian royal hugging a solid. A creature of light clinging to a creature of dirt. "Valerine," the queen hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "Release that thing immediately. You are shaming us." Valerine didn't let go. She turned her head, keeping one hand gripped tight on Ronin's shirt, and looked at her mother. Her violet eyes were burning with a fire that wasn't reflected light. It was her own. "He is warm," Valerine said. Her voice carried to the back of the hall. "He is broken," the queen countered. "He is bleeding on the floor." "He bled for me!" Valerine screamed, the harmonics in her voice cracking the nearby wine glasses. "You watched the stone fall. You calculated the loss. He moved. He didn't think. He didn't sing. He saved me!" She pressed her cheek against Ronin's chest. "You call him a solid, like it is a bad thing. But he is the only thing in this entire tower that is solid enough to lean on." Ronin looked down at her, stunned. He tentatively placed a hand on her head. "Kid, you're going to get yourself in trouble." "Then I am in trouble," she said fiercely. "But I am alive." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crude washer gyroscope Ronin had made her. She held it up to the queen. "This is physics, mother," she said, tears streaming down her face. "It wants to fall, but the motion keeps it standing. Ronin kept me standing." The queen stared at the toy. She stared at the blood on the floor. She stared at the way her daughter, her flawed, anxious daughter, was standing with a posture of absolute, unbreakable defiance. The queen looked at the crater where her daughter would have been crushed. The guards looked at the queen, waiting for the order to fire. Queen Solara took a breath. The light around her dimmed, softening from blinding white to a somber gold. She looked at Ronin, really looked at him. She saw the grime, the sweat, the blood. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but she also saw the way his hand was still protectively hovering over her daughter's head, even with 4 plasma rifles pointed at his heart. "Stand down," the queen commanded. The guards hesitated, then lowered their weapons. "Mother?" Valerine asked, her voice trembling but hopeful. "He is crude," the queen said, her nose wrinkling slightly. "He has stained the floor. He has interrupted the ascension." She walked forward until she stood over Ronin. She looked down. "However," the queen continued, her voice echoing through the hall, "the Xylian Empire values structural integrity above all else, and it appears," she gestured to the fallen stone, then to Ronin, "that this solid understands support better than I do." She extended a hand, not to Valerine, but to Ronin. It was a gesture that had never happened in 3,000 years of history. Ronin hesitated. He wiped his hand on his pants, trying to get the worst of the grease off, and took her hand. Her skin was cool, like polished glass. His was rough, calloused, and warm. She pulled him to his feet. "You require medical attention, Engineer Ronin," the queen said, "and a new uniform, one that is perhaps less flammable." "I like this uniform," Ronin said, wincing as he straightened his back. "It's got plenty of pockets." The queen's lip twitched, a microscopic crack in the mask. A smile. "We will discuss pockets later. Valerine!" The princess beamed, squeezing Ronin's hand one last time before stepping back to her mother's side. But she didn't float, she walked. Solid steps. "Yes, mother?" "Escort the engineer to the healing wing. Ensure he is treated with high protocol." The crowd gasped. High protocol was reserved for royalty. "Yes, mother," Valerine said. She grabbed Ronin's uninjured hand. "Come on, Ronin. I know a shortcut through the ventilation shafts. It's faster." "Princess," Ronin sighed, letting himself be dragged away as the stunned court parted like the Red Sea. "We really need to talk about your definition of a shortcut." Epilogue. Foundations 6 months later. The spire of Ethelgard was still perfect. It still shimmered in the starlight. But there were changes, if you knew where to look. In the royal gardens, amidst the singing flowers and light sculptures, there was a new installation. It wasn't made of crystal or light. It was a kinetic sculpture made of steel, brass, and gears. It clicked and whirred, spinning in perfect chaotic balance. Valérine sat on a bench next to it, reading a datapad on applied thermodynamics. She looked up as heavy boots crunched on the gravel path. Ronin walked in. He was wearing a new uniform. Still gray, still practical, but the fabric was higher quality, and on the shoulder sat the royal crest of the House of Solara. "Hey kid," Ronin said, handing her a thermos. "Smuggled you some of that terrible synthetic cocoa you like." "It is not terrible," Valérine said, taking it with a grin. "It tastes like comfort." "Queen behaving herself?" Ronin asked, sitting down next to her. "She scolded the Minister of Defense today for ignoring stress fractures in the perimeter shield," Valérine said proudly. She told him, "We do not ignore the cracks, Minister. We brace them." Ronin smiled, looking out over the clouds of the gas giant below. He touched the scar on his back through his shirt. It ached when it rained, but he didn't mind. He wasn't just a pair of hands anymore. He was the foundation, and for the first time in his life, drifting from job to job, planet to planet, Ronin realized he wasn't looking for the next exit. "Ronin? Yeah, Princess? Are you going to fix the fountain in the West Wing today?" "Yeah, pump shot. Can I come?" Ronin stood up and offered her a hand. "Grab your toolkit, kid. We've got work to do." As they walked away, the steel sculpture continued to spin behind them. A little bit wobble, a little bit noisy, but standing perfectly upright against the gravity of the world. Sometimes, the universe sends you exactly where you need to be. And sometimes, it takes a human to show the stars what it means to truly shine. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, drop a like and tell us in the comments. Would you have run towards the falling stone? Or would you have trusted the shields? Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars, but keep your feet on the ground.